Preface. This video is for anyone with interest, but especially for those who've attended diversity trainings based on Robin DiAngelo's work or critical race theory in general, and felt confused, uneasy, or subjected to undue pressure. Under Maoist rule in communist China, especially during the Cultural Revolution, thought reform methods were employed to purge bourgeois thinking from the minds of political dissidents. Research from that era provided insight into coercive techniques leading to the identification of a three-stage model of thought reform. This video explains how DiAngelo's book is arranged according to that three-stage model, and how she uses reform methods to purge white supremacy and indoctrinate her quasi-religious ideology. Combating dogma with shallow, oversimplified explanations is fighting a losing battle. I tried to do the opposite and be extremely thorough and very likely overcorrected. Despite its faults, I think the video will be useful to anyone troubled by this strange, new movement. This is a critique of White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I'm criticizing this book because it's harmful to everyone, to people of color, to white people, to all people. The book is harmful because DiAngelo's methods are harmful. She promotes racial mythologizing. She answers empirical questions with dogma. She imposes dogma on others in an authoritarian manner. And in prohibiting criticism, she takes herself to be infallible, which no one is. Eradicating racism is the right goal. But DiAngelo's methods are, historically, the very methods responsible for racism and other kinds of social persecution. I'm a Democrat. I'm against racism. I believe political activists have good intentions. But good intentions don't magically produce irrefutable theories or flawless strategies. Activists' claims must still be critically evaluated. Despite good intent, I think white fragility is harmful. This discussion gives an elaborate, in-depth explanation of how DiAngelo uses coercive tactics to indoctrinate her theory, and how her theory is grounded in a quasi-religious worldview. The manipulative methods in White Fragility have historical antecedents, particularly in Maoist thought reform programs. Explaining this requires very briefly reviewing two basic principles of Marxist theory. First principle of Marxist theory: class struggle is the basic reality of human social life. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx says, "The history of all society up to now is the history of class struggles." Marx imposed a rigid, dichotomous structure on reality and saw everything through that structure. There are oppressors and the oppressed. He believed the constant struggle between opposing forces moves history forward to the final goal of a classless society. Second principle of Marxist theory: the nature of the subject is wholly determined by society. By the subject, I mean the conscious awareness of humans. Here I have quotes from 3 different people because it helps to have this idea articulated in a few different ways. Quote 1 is from Marx. "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but, on the contrary, their social existence that determines their consciousness." Quote 2 is from philosopher Anthony O'Hare. "Holism is the idea that some collection of people, such as a race, a state, or a class, is somehow greater than the sum of the individuals that compose it, that it acts on them and is subject to its own autonomous laws of development. The view of society as an organism. Holism entails that individuals, the atoms of history, are essentially formed by the social organisms of which they are a part." End quote. Quote 3 is from Professor of Political Science Gerhard Niemeyer. "Communism asserts that people form different classes not only by virtue of the fact of their economic existence, but also because people living in similar circumstances also think alike. In a similar way, Hitler alleged that people with the same kind of physical build had the same kind of soul. Hitler believed men belonging to different races to be essentially different creatures. Marx taught that men belonging to different classes had no common values or ideas, that they had essentially differing consciousnesses. Let us note here that to classify phenomena, including people, for the purpose of observation is one thing. To attribute to such classes will, purpose, and a common consciousness is quite another. To say that the classes into which one has divided people are authors of action is an assertion which requires elaborate and hard-to-obtain proof. D'Angelo supports both principles in slightly updated forms. She sees this struggle in American culture as race rather than class-based. She subscribes to the holistic view that individuals are essentially formed by the power discourses of race, gender, sexuality, and so on. According to this view, a discourse's truth is determined by the group's power and nothing else. Whiteness was created several centuries ago to justify white domination and exploitation, and all whites born since are complicit in maintaining this lie for their own gain. White power discourses situate black people as abnormal or subordinate. The remedy is a revolutionary discourse that reallocates power to the marginalized group. The theory assumes reality is created entirely by language. Political correctness, because it changes language, establishes new realities. The Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, or Maoists, were obsessed with class, not race. They viewed the bourgeoisie, the upper class, as dominating, exploitative, and hateful. Just as D'Angelo sees white consciousness as the source of social inequality, the Maoists saw bourgeois consciousness as the root of social ills. They were devoted to ferreting out incorrect thinking and subjecting it to reform programs. Harvard psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton and MIT social psychologist Edgar Schein both studied survivors of the Chinese communist penal system in the 1950s and 60s. Both added to our knowledge of coercive tactics and manipulative social influence. Lifton's 1961 book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, a study of brainwashing in China, remains an authoritative reference for understanding cults, coercive persuasion, and thought reform. Lifton says, "The Chinese communists have developed a peculiar brand of soul surgery which they practice with impressive skill, the process of thought reform. The penal program responsible for these effects is just one part of the vast national policy of tse-tung kai-cao, ideological remolding or thought reform, or, as it has become known in the West, brainwashing. The Chinese have vigorously applied reform methods throughout all levels of the population, in universities, schools, special indoctrination centers, business and government offices, and even peasant groups. Their express justification is the conviction that all people retain influences of the reactionaries or ideological poisons from the former pre-communist society and must be made over into new men in order to take their place in the new society." End quote. Lifton quotes from the People's Daily, a Chinese paper and standard outlet for official communist views. "All crimes have definite social ideological roots. The evil ideology and evil habits left behind by the old society, calling for the injuring of others for self-profit and seeking enjoyment without labor, still remains in the mind of some people to a marked degree. Thus, if we are able to wipe out all crimes from their root, in addition to inflicting on the criminals the punishment due, we must also carry out effective measures to transform the various evil ideological conceptions in the minds of the people, so that they may be educated and reformed into new people." End quote. Like the Maoists, D'Angelo has detected a crime with definite social ideological roots, the ubiquitous crime of white supremacy, which remains in the evil ideology and habits of all white people. She, too, is implementing effective measures to transform whites into new people. Following Lifton and Schein's work, psychologist Stephen Hassan wrote his 1988 book, Combating Mind Control, where he discusses a 3-stage model of thought reform. The stages are: 1. Unfreeze, where personal defenses are broken down. 2, change, where indoctrination occurs. 3, refreeze, where the new identity is built up and reinforced. A similar model has been described by others, for example, by the French philosopher Jacques Ellul in his 1965 book, Propaganda. In an appendix on Mao Zedong's propaganda, under the heading of brainwashing, he discusses 3 stages. 1, disintegration of the individual. 2, creation of a collective conscience, plus reindoctrination. And 3, self-criticism and full engagement with the new line. Stage 1, unfreezing. Hassan says, to ready a person for radical change, his reality must first be shaken up. His indoctrinators must disorient him. His frames of reference for understanding himself and his surroundings must be challenged and broken down. Unfreezing can be accomplished by using a variety of approaches. China says unfreezing is the induction of a need or motive to change. This can be accomplished by deliberately inducing confusion and uncertainty. Self-doubt that cannot be challenged causes distress. Desire for relief overwhelms critical judgment, leaving people vulnerable to coercion. Hassan discusses common tactics for inducing confusion and self-doubt. He says, techniques such as double binds can also be used to unfreeze a person's sense of reality. A double bind forces a person to do what the controller wants while giving an illusion of choice. End quote. A double bind, also known as a Kafka trap, falsely presents a choice of 2 options, but the outcome is the same in both cases. For example, a person charged with a crime is pressured to confess, and at the same time told denial is a true sign of guilt. Confession and denial both indicate guilt. There's no way out. D'Angelo introduces the double bind on page 2 of White Fragility. She says, given how seldom we experience racial discomfort in the society we dominate, we haven't had to build our racial stamina. Socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we are either unaware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. End quote. So, you either have a deeply internalized sense of superiority or you do. Denial indicates fragility, a defense designed to preserve your sense of superiority. Admitting or denying both indicate guilt. You cannot challenge the claim. The negative behavior is beyond your control. You doubt yourself. You feel powerless. Jacques Ellul describes a similar process. The first objective will be to create an ambiguity in the mind of the prisoner with regard to his ideas and convictions, and uncertainty, a doubt, on questions of fact, and at the same time a feeling of guilt based on ideas of morality in the individual himself. I belong to a group, a class, a people that has done much harm, great wrongs to humanity. This kind of thinking will attach itself quite easily to a Christian conscience, for example. End quote. In the same vein, China says the communists tried to convince their prisoners that they had actually harmed the people, or intended to harm them, or had at some time in their lives, as members of a more privileged class, intentionally or unconsciously taken advantage of others because of inferior class status. The struggle meetings, both group criticism and self-criticism sessions, were designed to recall instances of such guilty behavior. End quote. In cults, some fundamentalist religions, and totalitarian regimes, the leaders are privy to the truth with a capital T. Others must submit to the truth for their own sake and for the sake of the world. The truth is a vision of the way the world should be. The vision is the only way. The vision must therefore be inculcated by any means necessary. Unfreezing starts the process by exploiting our natural tendency for guilt and shame. It instills feelings of unworthiness or inadequacy and an urge to relieve that distress. Relief is then promised in the form of a new political or spiritual agenda that embodies the truth. Unfreezing techniques are applied more vigorously in real-life settings, A book has limited power to break people down. Robin DiAngelo and followers of critical race theory conduct diversity trainings in corporate settings, universities, churches, and so on. In those settings, people are accused and condemned with double binds. Often they're prohibited from questioning, defending themselves, or even speaking. Here are 4 examples. Number 1, blocked and reported podcast episode entitled, "What a Really Stupid F***ing Way to Have a Really Important Conversation." I highly recommend listening to this. A woman describes her participation in a year-long diversity, equity, and inclusion training with Robin DiAngelo. The woman, a graphic designer, was charged with racism because a poster she made, copied from an actual ancient Grecian urn, contained something vaguely swastika-ish within a larger design. Neither she nor her co-workers were allowed to challenge the charge. Number 2, Jody Shaw, a self-described liberal and administrative assistant at Smith College. At a mandatory faculty retreat, a facilitator said, quote, "Any white person who expresses discomfort or distress or any kind of resistance toward talking about their race when asked to is not actually experiencing discomfort, so don't feel like you should comfort them because it's not discomfort. It's called white fragility and it's a power play." End quote. Number 3, a Seattle Public Schools anti-racist training told white teachers they had to bankrupt their privilege and that any resistance is simply fear of losing power. The materials say, quote, "As you begin your own inside-out work in this area, your lizard brain will start to freak out. It's afraid that you will have to talk about sensitive issues such as race, racism, classism, sexism, or any kind of ism. It's afraid that this conversation will make you vulnerable and open to some type of emotional or physical attack. But this fear is not real. It's just your amygdala's ploy to get you to stay in your comfort zone." Note, there is no evidence that the amygdala in white people functions to preserve their white supremacy. This is pseudoscience, asserted as fact. Number 4, Sandia National Laboratories. Male employees were sent on a 3-day re-education camp to deconstruct their white male culture. They had to admit they had internalized white supremacy and were guilty of collective sin. They were required to write letters to imaginary people of color and women, apologizing for their privilege and identity. A Sandia employee gave this information to Christopher Rufo, a reporter with City Journal, who was investigating these trainings. Rufo has a database of 500 to 600 corporations, schools, and government agencies conducting trainings similar to those described at Sandia. Rufo says that more than 1,000 whistleblowers have contacted him to complain that this ideology is divisive and harmful. Confession plays a large role in diversity trainings and played a large role in Maoist thought reform. Lifton viewed confession as integral to thought reform, claiming that, whatever its setting, thought reform consists of 2 basic elements. 1, confession, the exposure and renunciation of past and present evil. And 2, re-education, the making of the man in the communist or whatever ideology image. Note that Hassan Elul and Lifton's models are all slightly different ways of describing the same essential process. No model is more right than another. In order to break and remold people, the Maoists accused them of general immoral behavior and often of committing specific invented crimes. They then demanded confessions. These tactics were employed most forcefully in the penal system. Prisoners were frequently accused of being enemies of the people. Shine's prisoners report being told, "You are a self-serving exploiter. You've spent your life in the service of evil. You have dangerous social origins, incorrect attitudes and thoughts. You don't support the communist cause. You support imperialism and warmongering. You've been prejudiced against a minority group. You feel superior to others because of class origin. You lack social awareness and take no global social responsibility." Foreshadowing today's political rhetoric, prisoners were warned, to stand aside is to support the status quo. Shine says, quote, "The creation and exploitation of social guilt were possible with almost every prisoner who had already been successfully weakened by other means, even if he was not initially guilt-prone. One reason, among others, is that some evidence of having felt superior can always be dug out and turned into such guilt. The intellectual is vulnerable to accusations such as, "You don't mix with the common man, you don't even speak his language." The missionaries who went to China to bring Christianity to the people sometimes lived better than the masses, for whom they were supposed to be an example. If this argument was not convincing, it was pointed out to the missionary that he undoubtedly felt some superiority over the unchristianized heathens. End quote. After being accused of wrongdoings, prisoners were subjected to constant psychological battering sessions where they were shamed, berated, and forced to admit their transgressions. These were known as struggle sessions. The term struggle session derives from these Maoist practices and is used today to denote the same process, the use of peer pressure to force admission of privilege, racism, sexism, or bigotry. Prisoners from reactionary backgrounds were subjected to particularly vicious struggle sessions. Often they were falsely charged with specific crimes and tormented psychologically and physically until they confessed. Lifton describes how the, quote, victim sits in the middle of the cell while 6 or 8 prisoners form a circle around him, each in turn shouting invectives at him, denouncing him as an arch-criminal, a stubborn imperialist who refuses to recognize his crimes. End quote. Due to constant psychological pressure, prisoners initially adamant about their innocence became, over time, racked with intense humiliation, guilt, and anxiety. Eventually, these persisting feelings caused prisoners to accept responsibility for the alleged crimes. From the existence of emotional pain, they deduced they must have done something wrong. They could not otherwise explain their extreme emotional response. Shine says of the prisoners, quote, the person who was prone to anxiety and guilt was more susceptible because of his need to justify such feelings to himself once they were stimulated, end quote. In the next 2 quotes, Lifton describes how persistent feelings of guilt and anxiety eventually led to confusion and confabulation, that is, misremembering the past. Quote 1, the individual is so permeated by the atmosphere of guilt that external criminal accusations become merged with his subjective feelings of sinfulness, of having done wrong. He feels he must deserve this punishment. Quote 2, through the people's standpoint, he channels his non-specific feelings of guilt and anxiety into a paranoid pseudological system. He begins to view past events as an outgrowth of personal evil and destructiveness. His guilt becomes attached to specific actions, real or fantasied. End quote. Prisoners eventually thought, I feel so guilty and awful, I guess I must have done it. They rewrote their past to include committing specific crimes or immoral acts. When prisoners finally confessed, they were not given sentences. On the contrary, they were released from prison. Confession wasn't about crimes. Accusation and forced confessions were a powerful way of altering reality to make prisoners reconceive themselves, their history, and their social existence. Similar methods were used in other communist countries and totalitarian regimes in general. Dutch psychiatrist Joos Meerloo, who experienced fascist and communist totalitarian regimes during World War II, published his book, The Rape of the Mind, The Psychology of Thought Control, Menticide, and Brainwashing, in 1956. Meerloo was chief of the Dutch Army's psychological department. He later taught at Columbia University in the New School for Social Research. I'm going to read 5 quotes from his book. Note, he uses the term totalitaria to name the generic totalitarian state, whether fascist, communist, or other. Quote 1, mental blackmail starts wherever the presumption of guilt takes the place of presumption of innocence. End quote. Number 2, the totalitarians are very ingenious in arousing latent guilt in us by repeating over and over again how criminally the Western world has acted toward innocent and peaceful people. End quote. Number 3, the ordinary law-abiding citizen of totalitaria, far from being a hero, is potentially guilty of hundreds of crimes. He is a criminal if he is stubborn in defense of his own point of view. He is a criminal if he refuses to become confused. He is a criminal if he does not loudly and vigorously participate in all official acts. He can be a criminal by association or dissociation, by scapegoatism or by projection, by intention or by anticipation. He is a criminal if he refuses to become an informer. He can be tried and found guilty by every conceivable ism: cosmopolitanism, provincialism, deviationalism, mechanism, imperialism, nationalism, pacifism, militarism, objectivism, subjectivism, chauvinism, equalitarianism, practicalism, idealism. He is guilty every time he is something." End quote. Number 4, nearly all the mature ideals of mankind are crimes in totalitaria. Freedom and independence, compromise and objectivity, all of these are treasonable. In totalitaria, there is a new crime, the apostatic crime, which may be described as the obstinate refusal to admit imputed guilt. On the other hand, the hero in totalitaria is the converted sinner, the breast-beating recanting traitor, the self-denouncing criminal, the informer, the stool pigeon. End quote. Number 5, the totalitarian purge is always accompanied by an elaborate confession ceremonial in which the accused publicly repents his sins, much as did the witches of the Middle Ages. This is the general formula. I confess my doubts. Thanks to the criticism of my comrades, I have been able to purify my thinking. I bow in humility to the opinion of my comrades and to the party, and am thankful for the opportunity to correct my errors. End quote. Sociologist Richard Offshee and others have shown that coercive techniques used in police interrogations in the U.S. have led to false confessions and unjust convictions. In his 1992 article, Coercive Persuasion and Attitude Change, Offshee identifies influence procedures in police interrogations that can lead to unfreezing and change. He uses those terms explicitly in the same sense I've used them. Offshee says, quote, "Suspects may be given a polygraph examination and then falsely told that they failed, and the test reveals their unconscious knowledge of guilt. Suspects may be told that their lack of memory of a crime was caused by an alcohol or drug-induced blackout, was repressed, or is explained because the individual is a multiple personality. If innocent persons subjected to these sorts of influence techniques do not reject the false evidence and realize that the interrogators are lying to them, they have no choice but to doubt themselves." End quote. So, when presumed authorities charge people with transgressions that they are unaware of, don't remember, or cannot face for psychological reasons, it can be a powerful method of manipulation. Powerful enough to land people in prison for crimes they didn't commit. A final thought on confession. Critics of D'Angelo's book note she frequently confesses to racism and conclude she might be more racist than most. Lifton sees other aspects of confession. Echoing Mirlou's earlier comments, Lifton discusses how, in environments where guilt and shame are expected, confession becomes a vehicle for gaining status. He says, quote, "Confession becomes not only a means of atoning for guilt and shame, but also a vehicle for making progress and bettering one's standing. In the purging environment, self-debasement leads to increased prestige." End quote. Elsewhere, Lifton says, quote, "Repetitious confession is often an expression of extreme arrogance in the name of apparent humility." End quote. In Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, Lifton discusses Camus' novel The Fall. Lifton says, quote, "The enthusiastic and aggressive confessor becomes like Camus' character whose perpetual confession is his means of judging others. I practice the profession of penitent to be able to end up as judge. The more I accuse myself, the more I have the right to judge you." These insights might shed some light on D'Angelo's repeated confessions. Stage 2, Indoctrination. Section 1, Manipulation by Fragility. On page 5 of White Fragility, D'Angelo says, quote, "This book does not attempt to provide the solution to racism, nor does it attempt to prove that racism exists. I start from that premise. My goal is to make visible how one aspect of white sensibility continues to hold racism in place, white fragility." End quote. D'Angelo also wrote a paper entitled White Fragility in the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy. In that paper, she discusses the views of other whiteness scholars. This is a field that has been in place for 20 plus years. D'Angelo says, quote, whiteness studies begin with the premise that racism and white privilege exist in both traditional and modern forms, and rather than work to prove its existence, work to reveal it, end quote. D'Angelo does not prove but assumes that racism exists, and it exists in exactly the way described in strong claims like the following examples. 1. All white people are invested in and collude with racism. 2. Racism is systemic, societal, institutional, and omnipresent. 3. White racial hegemony saturates everyday life. 4. Racism is responsible for all average group differences in outcome between white and black people. Surely there is racism in the U.S. adversely affecting people of color. There is no doubt that racism is a real problem causing suffering and hardship, and all people should care about finding solutions. But the fact that racism exists does not make D'Angelo's strong claims true. D'Angelo's strong claims are, to borrow Gerhard Niemeyer's phrasing, assertions which require elaborate and hard-to-obtain proof. Declaring them to be absolute truths, without elaborate and hard-won proof, is simply declaring dogma as fact. Racism is real, but D'Angelo's strong characterization of it is fiction. D'Angelo sees her task as making visible or revealing racism. She will not give proof in the normal sense of providing empirical evidence. Instead, she will establish her claim by provoking the fragility response, which is, purportedly, evidence of racism. Readers or seminar attendees who recoil, get angry, or argue will be told those responses are evidence of racism. They'll think, I do feel irritated, I guess I'm racist. They will, like the Maoist prisoners and suspects with false confessions, deduce a conclusion from their emotional state. The problem is, those fragility responses are appropriate reactions to double binds, dogmatic propaganda, smug sanctimony, and baseless accusations of wrongdoing. Lifton, in Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, says, quote, the 100 Flowers incident reveals the potential for the release of bitter emotions directed both at thought reform and at the same regime which perpetuates it. Behind this lies the latent resentment which thought reform builds up in varying degrees within virtually all who are exposed to it. This resentment originates in a basic human aversion to excessive personal control, a phenomenon which I call the hostility of suffocation. Thought reform constantly provokes this hostility, first by stimulating it within individual participants, and then by creating conditions of group intensity which can magnify it to frenzy. In other words, thought reform is able to promote an emotional contagion of resentment as well as enthusiasm. End quote. Is D'Angelo revealing white fragility or the hostility of suffocation? By her own account, she constantly provokes a hostile response in her audience. She fails to consider that maybe her dogma and baseless accusations are causing that response. The only possible cause for her is racism. These manipulative tactics must be employed because, as I will explain, D'Angelo's theory is based on a quasi-religious worldview that no one is obligated to accept. Without manipulation, her theory would appeal only to those already steeped in that worldview. Emotional manipulation leads people to accept ideas because they feel they must, not because the truth has been adequately demonstrated. Section 2. Reasoning from a quasi-religious worldview. D'Angelo inverts the normal method of providing information about social issues. Usually, empirical evidence is provided, and from that, conclusions are drawn. In White Fragility, empirical conclusions are asserted as a priori truths at the outset, then a story is told illustrating how the alleged racism works. This is the story that is indoctrinated, a term I use deliberately. If her view was based on empirical data, it could be demonstrated. If her view contained premises that logically entailed a conclusion, an argument could be presented. Her view is neither. It is a story inculcated by repetition of the same general ideas, rephrased in different ways. As Hassan says, quote, repetition focuses on certain themes. The recruits are told how bad the world is, and that the unenlightened have no idea how to fix it. This is because ordinary people lack the new understanding that has been provided the leader. The leader is the only hope of lasting happiness. End quote. Jacques Ellul similarly says, quote, there is an endless repetition of formulas, explanations, and simple stimuli. Of course, in the beginning, all this merely evokes the subject's scorn and disbelief. After some time, however, erosion takes place. Whether the subject likes it or not, he ends up knowing by heart certain formulas of the catechism repeated to him 1,000 times. An entire Weltanschauung is unfolded progressively. Gradually, his traditional Christian, bourgeois, liberal, or feudal view of the universe is removed and replaced by a different view. End quote. How is this achieved in White Fragility? I'm going to compress D'Angelo's statements into a dialogue. I'll play the role of me, the interlocutor. D'Angelo, racism is a structure, not an event. Me, what is that structure? D'Angelo, an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. Me, how is that domination achieved? D'Angelo, by a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefits those defined and perceived as white. The system of structural power privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group. Me, how are whites privileged as a group? D'Angelo, with a set of cultural practices that are not named or acknowledged. Whites produce and reinforce the dominant narratives of society, such as individualism and meritocracy, and use these narratives to explain the positions of other racial groups. Me, how do the narratives lead to different outcomes? D'Angelo, by constantly creating advantage for whites and disadvantages for people of color. Me, what kind of advantage? D'Angelo, racial disparity between whites and people of color continues to exist in every institution across society, and in many cases is increasing rather than decreasing. Me, how do institutions cause group disparities? D'Angelo, through interlocking forces of oppression, through a network of systemically related barriers, through broad interlocking patterns. Me, what kind of barriers? D'Angelo, people of color are confined and shaped by forces and barriers that are not accidental, occasional, or avoidable. These forces are systemically related to each other in ways that restrict their movement. Me, how is their movement restricted? D'Angelo, by racism that is deeply embedded historical system of institutional power. We live in a culture that circulates relentless messages of white superiority. Anti-blackness is foundational to our very identities as white people. All white people are invested in and collude with racism. Me, how do white people collude? D'Angelo, racism is a social system embedded in the culture and its institutions. Whites benefit from the ideologies of colorblindness, meritocracy, and individualism. We are born into this system and have no say in whether we will be affected by it. Me, why do we have no say? D'Angelo, whiteness includes a set of cultural practices that are not recognized by white people. Much of white supremacy's power is drawn from its invisibility. Me, how do you know it exists? D'Angelo, racial disparity between whites and people of color continues to exist in every institution across society, and in many cases is increasing rather than decreasing. Me, how is that caused by white supremacy? D'Angelo, through the ongoing use of institutional power and authority that support prejudice and systematically enforce discriminatory behaviors with far-reaching effects. The mantras and slogans in the dialogue are ultimately a retelling of the old Marxist drama now starring the white bourgeoisie. According to Marxist theory, the economic structure of society, or base, determines the superstructure, which includes all aspects of culture, politics, law, education, religion, morality, art, and so on. In a capitalist society, the entire superstructure upholds and enforces the power of the bourgeois class. Through the superstructure, the ruling class covertly imposes its belief system on the working class, fooling them into accepting their condition as inevitable and legitimizing their oppression. It is not the case that the fortunes of individuals simply vary in a free market economy. Rather, the bourgeois class cruelly conspires to preserve their power by means of a free market economy, which was deliberately designed to be a vast Ponzi scheme dressed up as freedom. In D'Angelo's version, the superstructure, or in modern terms, the ruling hegemony, serves to uphold and enforce the power of white people. The bourgeoisie is now the class of white people of every economic status. The U.S., past and present, is, quote, a socio-political system of domination based on racial categories that benefits those defined and perceived as white. This system of structural power privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group, end quote. Like Marx, D'Angelo's explanation is total. Racism is everywhere, all the time. Her explanation implicates all white people. For example, your parents could not have taught you not to be racist, and your parents could not have been free of racism themselves. A racism-free upbringing is not possible. It is not humanly possible to be free of prejudice. All white people are invested in and collude with racism. Racism is structured into our society, and white complicity is an inevitable result. Because I was socialized as a white in a racism-based society, I have a racist worldview, deep racial bias, racist patterns, and investments in the racist system that has elevated me. And her explanation applies to the entire superstructure. For example, the default of our current system is the reproduction of racial inequality. Our institutions were designed to reproduce racial inequality. Racism is systemic, societal, institutional, omnipresent, and epistemologically embedded phenomenon that pervades every vestige of our reality. For white racial hegemony to saturate everyday life, it has to be secured by a process of domination, or those acts, decisions, and policies that white subjects perpetrate on people of color. D'Angelo reasons as follows. Given that there are, on average, disparities in outcome between blacks and whites, it must be the case that the entire political, economic, and social system that exists, or has existed historically, is responsible and designed specifically for racial domination. All white people must be complicit in this domination scheme. How does she know this? No body of empirical evidence supports the veracity of this extreme conception. Confirmatory evidence would require close observation of every single white person and every single institution in the U.S., an impossible task. She knows because it is a self-evident axiom of a theory that she believes in. It is an a priori principle through which reality is interpreted. It is, in short, an article of faith. This kind of quasi-religious thinking follows in the steps of Marx, as Gerhard Niemeyer explains, quote, communist ideology assumes that the basic reality of anything social is the class struggle. It thus explains, in terms of the class struggle, all salient events of history, the evils of human life, politics and the state, revolutions, ideas, and religion. The doctrine consists of a characteristic mixture of scientific analysis, myth, and prophecy, a mixture which enables it to impress men with the appeals of science along with those of religion, end quote. In the origins of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt discusses total explanations of this kind. Quote, "The claimed total explanation promises to explain all historical happenings, the total explanation of the past, the total knowledge of the present, and the reliable prediction of the future. In this capacity, ideological thinking becomes independent of all experience. It becomes emancipated from the reality we perceive with our five senses and insists on a truer reality concealed behind all perceptible things, dominating them from this place of concealment and requiring a sixth sense that enables us to become aware of it. The sixth sense is provided by precisely the ideology, that particular ideological indoctrination which is taught by the educational institutions, established exclusively for this purpose, to train the political soldiers in the Ordensburgen of the Nazis or the schools of the Comintern and Cominform." End quote. Alan Bullock, in his 1971 book Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, describes Hitler's conception of the Jews in Mein Kampf. Quote, "Like all obsessions, the Jew is not a partial, but a total explanation. The Jew is everywhere, responsible for everything. The modernism in art and music Hitler disliked, pornography and prostitution, the anti-national criticism of the press, the exploitation of the masses by capitalism and, its reverse, the exploitation of the masses by socialism, not least for his own failure to get on. Behind all this, Hitler soon convinced himself, lay a Jewish world conspiracy to destroy and subdue the Aryan peoples." End quote. The problem with these total explanations is summed up well in these two short quotes. The first from Richard Hofstadter, quote, "There is a great difference between singling out those conspiratorial acts that do on occasion occur and weaving a vast fabric of social explanation out of nothing but the skeins of evil plots." The second quote from John Gardner, quote, "Political extremism involves two prime ingredients, an excessively simple diagnosis of the world's ills and a conviction that there are identifiable villains in back of it all." End quote. Totalized political and social explanations purport to explain real-world facts, but by transcending the empirical realm in their content, they become myths and act on our psyches as myths do. Terrestrial conflicts are transformed into messianic struggles. Once the problem is conceptualized this way, critical thinking is suppressed. In a divine crusade against evil, there is only one mindset and one course of action. There's no room for fact-checking, counter-arguments, compromise, or the possibility that adversaries might not harbor the evil attributed to them. Totalized explanations cause extremism. Given what we know from empirical data and first-hand experience of people of color, no one should deny that racism exists. But the appropriate conclusion to draw is somewhat more moderate. That is, some practices or institutions wrongly produce disparate outcomes. Some people, not all, harbor racist beliefs and exhibit racist behavior. An imperfect system filled with imperfect people, some of whom are more racist than others, is a far different diagnosis than saying a race of cruel, greedy people have constructed a system in order to dominate others and exalt whiteness. The latter claim is too broad and oversimplified to accurately reflect any real circumstances, and more crucially, it is the very kind of social myth that led to catastrophe in fascist and communist regimes. Why are we trying to solve racial problems by relying on mythical conceptions that have led to misery and mass murder? D'Angelo might respond that white people are saturated in racist ideology, and she must combat it with her own extreme view. If anyone objects, she'll insist they simply do not understand socialization, a process producing thoroughly internalized, virtually ineradicable white supremacy. But where is the evidence that socialization works this way? Consider other types of socialization in the U.S. Americanism, we might say, is the ideology that America is the greatest country on earth, that democracy is the best form of government, that good Americans love God and country, prize freedom, and value a puritanical work ethic. In spite of this, there are, and always have been, in some form or another, flag burners, America haters, secessionists, communists, fascists, terrorists, atheists, occultists, Satan worshippers, and people who prefer to spend their days surfing, sleeping, wandering the country in a bus, taking LSD, and so on. That's how actual socialization works. It's imperfect. It doesn't always take. Even when it does, the result is not a lasting, unchanging condition like an incurable disease. Socialization instills ideas or beliefs, but it is not impossible, and in some cases it's fairly easy to change ideas or beliefs. What other socialization results in an outcome where it's impossible to change or eradicate deeply held beliefs? People socialized in fundamentalist religions and controlling cults do, in many cases, break away and overcome deeply held biases, fears, and anxieties. People grow up in groups that demean women, homosexuals, or different religions, and still, over time, move beyond those beliefs, often without needing years of arduous therapy. What other form of socialization produces complete internalization in every single person? In the later years of the Soviet Union, decades of communism entrenched that ideology as the norm. The government controlled all forms of media. The KGB prevented any open dissent, and on top of that, people were subjected to daily communist propaganda. Even in that environment of total saturation with no access to counter-messaging, the socialization didn't take in every case. But somehow in America, where no messaging of any type was ever that total or unopposed, every single white person has completely internalized an almost ineradicable form of white supremacy. D'Angelo might say much of the conditioning is nonverbal, leading to unconscious racist beliefs. But again, in what other cases does socialization work that way? In the US, there has been, for the last 50 years or so, explicit counter-messaging in most places, certainly in liberal parts of the country and among educated people. Most of us were taught to treat everyone as equals and that racism is cruel and unfair. But we are asked to believe that overt positive messaging has basically no effect. And, at the same time, messaging that is largely implicit, unnamed, and invisible causes a more thorough, intractable internalization than the Soviet process just described. This characterization of racism, insofar as it posits a virtually permanent condition provoked by the subtlest of stimuli, better exemplifies an innate disposition. D'Angelo's goal is to blame American culture, so that is definitely not her view. While it's possible that a trait like tribalism is an innate disposition, tribal affiliations as observed in the real world are unstable, variable, and can, but certainly do not always align across race. Tribalism would therefore not account for the enduring, ubiquitous anti-Black racism posited by D'Angelo. D'Angelo also claims that racism is the cause of all disparate average outcomes between white and Black people. This is another totalized claim she takes to be self-evidently true, but it is not a self-evident truth. In the US and UK, Asians have, on average, higher incomes, more education, and less incarceration than white people. There is no reason to believe those differences are due to racism against whites. There can be group differences that are not due to racism or oppression. If you look, the world is full of group differences. For example, in terms of income and educational achievement, the following average differences between groups have been observed. In the US, white mainline Protestants have better outcomes than white evangelical Protestants. Hindus have better outcomes than Buddhists. Reform Jews have better outcomes than Orthodox Jews. Surely racism is a factor contributing to unequal outcomes, but insisting it is the sole factor is simply speculation dogmatically asserted as absolute truth. Different beliefs, habits, and priorities can lead to different average outcomes. This fact has no implications about the intrinsic value of those beliefs, habits, and priorities. It implies nothing inherently negative about any group. Is Buddhism worse than Hinduism because there are average disparities between groups? No. D'Angelo's theory is not meant to reflect reality, but to achieve a certain outcome. By the theory's own assumptions, all white people are invested in and collude with racism, so no white person can claim exemption. By the theory's own assumptions, any challenge to it indicates denial or a power grab. All opposition is therefore racist and invalid, so no one can object. By the theory's own assumptions, racism is structural, systemic, omnipresent, and pervades every vestige of reality. This ubiquity makes every charge of racism true a priori. No claim ever needs supporting evidence. So, activists can make any charges they want with ease and impunity. But all the power of the theory comes from its own assumptions. Philosopher Karl Popper refers to this as reinforced dogmatism. He says, quote, "By making arguments and criticism impossible, Hegel intends to make his own philosophy proof against all criticism, so that it may establish itself as a reinforced dogmatism. The psychoanalyst can always explain away any objection by showing they are due to the repressions of the critic. Marxists, in a like manner, are accustomed to explaining the disagreement of an opponent by his class bias. Such methods clearly destroy the basis of rational discussion, and they must ultimately lead to anti-rationalism and mysticism." End quote. In response to precisely these theories and their reinforced dogmatism, Popper recommended, for the advance of science and human knowledge, that scientific theories be formulated in a way that makes them theoretically falsifiable. If there is no way for a theory to be false, if no observable evidence disconfirms it, then it is always true. But under these conditions, truth loses all its meaning. The theory becomes, in Hannah Arendt's words, emancipated from reality, and truth denotes nothing more than a way of constructing a theory so it is secure from every attack. Everyone could formulate their theories this way, and all theories would be unassailable, but the advance of knowledge would come to a grinding halt. That's why it's not recommended. The requirement of falsifiability forces the theory to answer to reality, and in doing so makes knowledge possible. Admitting contradictory evidence would dilute the potency of D'Angelo's theory, undermining its chief purpose. The theory is not intended to be true. It is meant to emotionally blackmail people into capitulating to the demands of political activists. This strategy has roots in the neo-Marxist critical theory playbook. For example, feminist Elizabeth Gross, in her 1986 article, "What is Feminist Theory?" Here I give 4 quotes from Gross. Number 1, feminist theory cannot be accurately regarded as a competing or rival account, diverging from patriarchal texts over what counts as true. It is not a true discourse, nor a more objective or scientific account. It could be appropriately seen rather as a strategy, a local specific intervention with definite political aims and goals. It seeks effective forms of intervention into systems of power in order to subvert them and replace them with other more preferable. End quote. Number 2, feminist theory doesn't simply aim at replacing one truth with another. It aims to render patriarchal system, methods, and presumptions unable to function, unable to retain their dominance and power. End quote. Number 3, Since feminist theory lacks the means to directly confront a sophisticated patriarchal theoretical regime, feminists have had to resort to forms of intellectual guerrilla warfare. End quote. Number 4. Because it refuses to accept the pre-given values of truth, objectivity, universality, neutrality, and abstract reason, feminist theory is not committed to or motivated by these values. End quote. Gross, like D'Angelo, believes that discourses have truth only as a function of power. So, the notions of, for example, truth, objectivity, and reason have authority in ascertaining knowledge only by virtue of their association with white men. Feminists and other marginalized people are therefore not beholden to these values and can reject them when expedient. Popper's white male requirement of falsifiability, then, can be ignored. For Gross and D'Angelo, theories should be emancipated from reality and judged only in terms of their dedication to political liberation. Not surprisingly, this statement is also a basic tenet of Marxist theory. The problem is, people are not omniscient and do not always know how to actualize liberation, especially grand-scale political liberation. Communists tried to create egalitarian utopias, but produced oppressive regimes that ultimately collapsed. Good intentions can pave the way to hell. Creating a better world requires not just the right goals, but also theories that are tethered to reality and revised in light of real-world consequences. In sum, D'Angelo's theory is like a structure built on clouds. It is grounded not in empirical fact, but in her quasi-religious neo-Marxist worldview. That worldview consists of unproven conjectures which no one is required to accept. For example, the U.S. socio-political economic base was designed to enforce and sustain white dominance, and all whites are complicit in this cruel scheme. People have no unique existence as individuals, but only as representatives of the interests of their particular race. All white people are subject to a magic socialization process, unlike any other occurring in nature, that produces deeply entrenched racism in every person without exception. All average group differences between blacks and whites are due to oppression. All white people, in virtue of being white, are capable of and culpable for the transgressions of white people who live before them. The repeated catchphrases and explanations that make up the bulk of the book are not reflections of reality, but ideological exhortations, Marxian amalgams of pseudoscience and myth. They are an example of, in Elizabeth Gross's words, not true discourse nor scientific account, but a strategy with political aims, intellectual guerrilla warfare that is not committed to or motivated by the values of truth, objectivity, or reason. Stage 3. Refreezing. Hassan defines refreezing as building up and reinforcing the new identity. Ellul describes it as self-criticism and full engagement with the new line. In this final stage, new types of correct conduct are introduced and reinforced with praise and positive rewards. Both Lifton and Shine report the Maoist use of the phrase working through, meaning working through resistance to thought reform. Lifton describes this process, quote, "Be working through. The prisoner must express, act upon, and live the principles of thought reform. That is, in communist terminology, he must combine theory with practice. He may at first do this only outwardly, and then ritualistically, as if reciting a catechism. But through this interminable group therapy, he eventually finds himself thinking and feeling in terms of these truths. He must constantly analyze his alleged deficiencies, his thought problems, and his resistances. Depth interpretations are available for all varieties of nonconformity. Everything is reducible to the insights of the Marxist doctrine. He works through every barrier to reform. Finally, he approaches the ultimate attainment of thought reform, the acquisition of a new view of the world and a new personal relationship to the world. The communist world, formerly considered aggressive and totalitarian, is now seen as peace-loving and democratic. He identifies himself fully with his captors. He is happy in his faith. He has been reborn. End quote. Lifton notes that depth interpretations, what we now call subconscious explanations, are available for all varieties of nonconformity. That means if a person shows resistance, a deviant subconscious motive will be blamed. There is simply no other reason for nonconformity. Also note that present-day activists use the phrase "do the work" to designate the same process as working through. In the final chapter of White Fragility, entitled "Where Do We Go From Here?", D'Angelo describes her version of working through. D'Angelo labels the racist view the dominant paradigm and contrasts it with the transformed paradigm, the view we are meant to have after her education process. After transformation, we will respond to feedback on our racist patterns with reflection, listening, apology, engaging, and believing. We will no longer defend ourselves. We will only be grateful and seek more feedback. We will learn how to be self-critical. We will recognize and interrupt every potentially negative gesture, thought, and word. D'Angelo says, "A positive white identity is an impossible goal. White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. But that doesn't mean you should stop identifying it as white. You should, instead, strive to be less white. You should engage in the continuous work of identifying your internalized superiority and how it may be manifesting itself. You must never consider yourself finished with your learning." In short, the woke world, formerly considered aggressive and totalitarian, will now be seen as peace-loving and democratic. You will identify fully with Robin DiAngelo. You will be happy in your faith. You will be reborn. Confession document of Professor Chin Yulin. In Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, Lifton includes a full written confession by Professor Chin Yulin made during the Chinese Thought Reform campaign of 1951 to 1952. Professor Chin studied in the U.S., mostly at Harvard, and was regarded as China's leading authority on formal logic. The full confession is several pages long. I'm reading only a few sections to show the reform process from the first-person perspective. Section 1, My Ideology of Special Privileges. In order to maintain my way of life, I had to have special privileges. I felt the need for these privileges. I enjoyed these privileges, became obsessed by the ideology of special privileges, and I became one of the privileged few of Singha. Though I was privileged, I yet refused to shoulder the accompanying responsibilities. Motivated by the educational ideology of the bourgeoisie, I was of infinite harm to the university program. For this I now hate myself beyond measure. Section 2, My Political Attitude. My crust is based on the past prevailing economic social foundation, that is, the capitalistic social system. In order to protect this crust, I had to give my political support to the old system of democracy. As a confirmed individualistic liberal, I have always based my political attitude upon this point of view. Only now have I realized that the old democracy is but the dictatorship of the bourgeois class, and the so-called individual freedom is but the freedom for the bourgeoisie to exploit and oppress the laboring people. Section 3. The Teachers' Study Movement and the Three Anti-Campaign. I now consider the fundamental ideological source for my personal crust of selfishness to be the extremely depraved liberalist and bourgeois ideology of striving after individual freedom. The philosophical manifestation of this ideology was found in my preoccupation with an abstract game of concepts. In my personal philosophy of life, this ideology was manifested in my decadent, above politics, above class, above the world, and above humanity viewpoint. This kind of ideology was the ideology of the exploitive class. I shall smash my personal crust and eradicate that bourgeois ideology. Section 4. My determination. He who loves New China well must know that in New China the people are on their feet and have come into their own. This New China is working for the interests and welfare of the people of China as well as of the world. I want to take part in the glorious and mighty enterprises. I am now close to 60, and I'm a criminal for having sinned against the people. From now on I shall strive to become a new man and a teacher of the people in substance as well as in name. Conclusion. D'Angelo and diversity consultants, following her model, employ the kind of dogma, emotional blackmail, and authoritarian rigidity found in cults, fundamentalist religions, and totalitarian political regimes. There is no theory in the realm of human knowledge that we have enough certainty about to demand that people assent and to forbid them from objecting or questioning. At the very best, we have empirical theories backed up by mountains of data, like the Standard Model of Physics or the theory of evolution. Presenting those theories in an authoritarian manner is still entirely inappropriate. Dogmatic ideas enforced with rigid control should always be an immediate red flag that you are being harangued and harassed by an ideologue. Their authoritarian approach comes from believing that compassion produces indubitable empirical knowledge about the causes of social phenomena and the solutions for social inequities. But compassion doesn't yield empirical knowledge. Compassion and empirical knowledge are logically distinct. Woke activists incorrectly believe that objecting to their theory is hate speech. This is false. Hateful is not wanting equality, dignity, or happiness for others, not questioning specific claims advanced in a sociological theory. An objector might believe the theory will prevent equality, dignity, or happiness in the long run. How is stating that a form of hatred? D'Angelo's theory is particularly harmful because it leaps, without warrant, from a moderate to an extreme position. There is a world of difference between some and all when speaking of racism in systems and especially in people. This point has been made but bears repeating. In this context, when the dial is turned to the extreme all position, matters of degree are transformed into matters of kind. Explanations become myths. Groups of people morph into monolithic malevolent forces. Social and political tensions are elevated to transcendent struggles. The Nazis totalized racial ideology of the Jews and cited hysteria and a plan for total annihilation. The communist totalized conception of the bourgeoisie provoked the same paranoid frenzy, leading to murder, imprisonment, and oppression. D'Angelo's conception of whiteness is a racial myth. She believes promoting this myth will help people of color. In fact, circulating racial myths of any kind opens a dreadful Pandora's box of hatred, paranoia, and hysteria. A box that should have been bolted shut after the 20th century and never opened again. Promoting such myths licenses that strategy for all to use. It's a gift to actual racists and white supremacists. Racial myths cause hatred, and hatred begets hatred in return. In the U.S., stoking racial hatred against white people may well lead to a backlash against people of color. Racist beliefs have caused suffering, brutality, oppression, and death. Everyone should understand why these ideas are false, dangerous, and cruel. The fundamental error at the heart of racist beliefs is assigning a pernicious essence to a group of people and assuming all members have that essence, regardless of their individual behavior. Races of people are one victim of this error. Classes, ethnicities, and religions have been harmed by the same mistake. It is also true that groups of people have suffered enormously from accusations of inherent deviancy or cruelty and charges of conspiring against others for their own gain. Nazi Germany and communist totalitarian regimes provide endless evidence supporting this claim. The fundamental error is the same in all cases. The remedy should be to recognize and stop committing this fundamental error in all its myriad forms. That means don't do it to any race, ethnicity, religion, class, gender, or social group. The fundamental error is not corrected in white fragility, critical race theory, or general woke theory. On the contrary, the fundamental error is enthusiastically defended and encouraged. It is proselytized in universities and corporate diversity trainings and even taught to children. And stunningly, the media, academy, and corporations are outdoing each other to show solidarity with this error. Like lemmings eagerly racing over the edge of a cliff.